Thanks for coming in. It's been a while. I've been really kind of wanting to sit and talk to you because, it's weird. Number one, Liz in my big bedroom, known her for years. We've done loads of work together, support her work 100%. But every time that we have a conversation, it's always in a conversation with others.
Yeah.
And I always kind of wanted opportunities for us to just quickly reason and for me to use my platform for everybody to see who you are and also to find out how they can contact you as well.
Thank you.
So I want to get straight to the point. Early years, as a youth work practitioner, as a criminologist, and all of the work that I do, it was about... It's been the last 12 months we had this conversation.
Yeah.
But I remember talking about the criminal justice pipeline and the school to prison pipeline and me doing my PhD criminology thing. And it was kind of like, I remember your face was kind of like, Craig, the nursery to prison pipeline. I have never heard that before. Number one, I think you need to trademark that.
Okay.
And I think number two, pushing you need to do your PhD. And I feel like that is a chapter. I know you're writing a book.
Yeah.
So I feel like that needs to be a chapter in itself because it needs to be a thing where we're referencing you in terms of that. And the reason why it's important for me in this conversation is because I can honestly admit that it's an element that when we say children, I'm not talking about children as in early years, I'm saying children as young as like 10, 11 onwards. So when you said to me nursery to prison pipeline, that's really kind of got me thinking in terms of my own research. So, nursery to prison pipeline, what are we talking about?
It's really interesting, isn't it, that you would say, as somebody who is a youth worker, as somebody who has done criminology, and somebody who's a father as well, that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of childhood 0 to 5. That often when we talk about childhood now, we're thinking, if you don't work in the early years, we're thinking about childhood being, I guess, from 7 years old onwards, or whenever there's an introduction into the formalised education system, which is reception class and primary, insofar as, I guess, the general public might look at it. But when I think about childhood, I always think about formalised processes and structures and systems and institutions as the nursery being one. So when a child leaves the family home and they go into a place which is providing care and education, which is the nursery setting or the preschool setting, there's a process of institutionalization that's happening from that point. So it's really interesting that when we're thinking about youth work, people think about the school to prison pipeline and forget about the nursery. And I think there's something to be said about the level of disregard for childhood in this Western kind of context, and also the value and the voice of the child in the Western context. Because I know, coming from a Caribbean, specifically a Jamaican heritage background, the voice of the child and the opinion of the child, it's looked at in a very different way. And when we're thinking about things in terms of, I guess, an African-centered approach, the value, think about things like naming, the name that you give your child. It's an absolutely important thing, and it's really valued. The ceremonies that are involved around the child coming into the world and the power that child has. So when we're thinking about pipelines, we're thinking about journeys, we're thinking about institutions. And one of the things that we can't afford to do is forget that the early childhood institution, the nursery, is part of that. And
it's weird because, I've volunteered, I've supported your work, I've been in the nursery working with those preschoolers. But when I was in those particular spaces, I guess for me at the time of my development, I was just looking at it as masculinity work, identity work. But when you actually think about it in context, it actually does fit.
Of course.
And that's what I'm saying, is that I respect the fact that you've given me that kind of information to help with my own critical thinking.
But this was like many years ago as well. To think about, why did I invite you in the first place? Always think, why do you think I invited you in? Why did you think it was so important for me to have you? And I've spoken about this before, Craig, but it wasn't just a matter of just getting a man or getting a black man. It was about getting you, because of the work that you were doing and actually how that would inform your practice and inform your process of thinking about childhood. And I got you to work specifically with sets of children who I knew there was trauma associated in their lives. And I spoke to you in depth about the background of their families, people that we knew very well from the community, people that we didn't necessarily knew had children all the time. And so when we think about the family patterns, we think about things that happen, I would tell you that often was the case in my work that I would know one dad for a period of 7 years, and every 2 or 3 years he might come back to the nursery with another child, but that child wasn't birthed from the same mother. And so what happened is that I had it's like almost like a longitudinal study. I had that connection with the father all of the time, and I was meeting different mothers. And that is not to speak to a stereotype. It isn't to say this was always the case, but it was something that informed how those children navigated the world and also how they understood family, parenting, and development. And so when you were coming in, you knew there were times when the children were coming in and calling you dad.
Yeah.
And they were holding onto your leg.
I remember that was probably one of the most weird experiences.
Yeah.
And just to kind of give people context, it was like nap time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I remember I was tired myself. I think I might have been fasting that day.
Yeah.
And I remember lying down, and I remember getting a little doze, and then I remember opening my eyes, and there was like 6 and 7 kids like on my shin, on my knee, couple on my shoulder.
Yeah.
And it's mad because as a practitioner as myself working with young people, I've never worked in that space before, and all I kept thinking, and I don't know why I was thinking that, but what happens if a parent comes in and sees some big black dude lying on the floor with Holy Picnic sitting around them? But I kind of learnt over time, and this is why I always kind of say that the work that you're doing is legacy work, and it's important that we give platform and opportunity for people that are observing these things to see how our work is so interconnected. And I guess in terms of my own growth and development, just not as a researcher but also as a professional, and I think that's why these conversations for me are really important. But what that really taught me was how important I am in terms of contribution to community. So when I see a lot of young men and young women in our community and social media and music and fashion and popular cultures are moving young people into a particular way of behaviour and thinking, I can't just help but thinking, if we got them earlier, if we got them engaged. And I remember watching something on social media the other day, and it was a bathroom and mum was twerking. You had the son, and I don't know if it was cousins in the background, and they were all on some, and then you had the girls in the background, and I was thinking, wow. So when we're talking about how young people and adultification, I just want you to really kind of touch on that, because it's a big issue that, we theoretically people are talking about it now, but it's something that I know in your work you've spoke about for quite some time.
Forever. And we already know that the black childhood and white childhood is not the same. Black children are not given the same liberty as white children. And so that all feeds into the adultification process. They do not get to have the opportunity to be viewed through a childhood lens. And childhood is about joy, it's about exploration, it's about imagination, it's about making mistakes, it's about learning from those mistakes. But it's also about a childhood that's facilitated by adults who care and love and understand. So when we're thinking about adultification, first of all, we're thinking about how black children are seen through a lens of posing risk. That there's always going to be a problem that comes. We don't know what the problem is, or, in terms of how children are socialised, black children, there's not a specific problem that practitioners might know, but there's always this kind of erring on the side of caution when it comes to black children. So there is an assumed risk. And that doesn't leave just because a child is 2 or 3 or 4. In fact, that happens at 2 and 3 and 4. And so the black child running up and down, I always say this, running up and down, that child is the child that, possibly ADHD. Yeah. Chance they've got autism. They just don't know how to listen. The white child isn't seen through that lens, and we see how that process happens all throughout that child's life into adolescence and into adulthood. So when we're looking at crimes that are committed, we're looking at it through the lens of adultification, because we know a 15-year-old black girl is not going to be looked at in the same way or given that forgiveness that a 15-year-old white girl is. And it has to be looked at through that binary lens, because that's the way in which I always talk about this. This is how white supremacy works. We internalise so many notions of white supremacy, even in you internalising sexism through a white supremacist lens. Your internalisation of sexism told you that if a parent walked in and saw you lying on the floor with lots of children, they might look at you through a lens. And I know what you're alluding to. I know what it is that you're fearing, and you shouldn't have that fear. But the way in which that you've internalised that means that you're perpetuating the same kind of values that another little black child's going to have, and perhaps that little black boy's going to have that. Yo, childcare's not for me. I don't want to work with youths. If I'm working with youths, they've got to be 13, 14, 15. When you saw the value that you brought as a black man working with children under 5, you saw that value, and you saw it year in, year out, all of the time. What you were able to give was a lens through which the children were given childhood. They had the right to childhood. They had the right to joy. They weren't looked at through an adultified lens. You weren't going in there and treating them as adults. You were going in there and falling in line with the culture that I had promoted in my setting, which meant all of those black and brown children had a right to joy and a right to childhood.
Yeah, you're teaching there, Liz, and you know what? I just want to continue with this conversation now. I don't want to cut it. And I think when we talk about kind of the earlier space, we work with a lot of parents, and as an organisation, we're advocates for parents that need support with their children. And in the current climate of what's happening now in the middle of COVID-19, loads of tit for tat violent behaviours that we're displaying from young people. And one particular case, we supported the family getting moved out of a community where a house got shot at, and a child was in the household. And sometimes we kind of forget about the impact of the children in that particular space. And I'm sure that in your practice you've worked with parents, you've worked with the children directly that have been impacted by that. But I just wanted you kind of to touch on those parents that watch these things that say, all right, cool, you're being theoretical, you're talking and I hear you and I'm with it, but what do we say to those parents that need help and support? And what do we say to those practitioners that are developing, that want to enter into this particular space?
I think one of the things that we have to be really mindful of is judgment. And so when we're talking about the things that you said to me, looking at a video when a mom is twerking and there's children in the background and listen, there is no place for judgment in that space, first of all. And we have to be really conscious of the way in which we view parenting and how we view child rearing. Because we all know, for me particularly as a child of the 80s, growing up in the 90s, carnival was standard. We were all going Handsworth Park, okay? We were all going and we were experiencing, exposed to things that people might say in a theoretical sense as a safeguarding person that wasn't appropriate. But everybody was catching a wine and we were just there standing and watching, and we were encouraging that, and we loved the vibe. It was a part of the culture. Do you understand? So when we're looking at how things have kind of evolved, we now have become the people who are looking at things critically and judging, and it's dangerous because when we start judging parenting and child rearing through a lens which kind of puts us outside, so it's an us and them, that's where the divisions start, and that's where trust is lost. So when you're coming into this space, as somebody who works with children who have been impacted by violence, judgment needs to be left at the door. And it's very much easier said than done, but you must do that, particularly if you are part of the community that you're engaging with, because parents can sense judgment. And so when we think about judgment and link that to shame, we know shame is not a way in which we want to manage how parents kind of are guided through this, or as practitioners. So when mothers often spoke to me about some of the traumas that they were experiencing because they were in volatile relationships, they were in violent relationships, what they don't want to hear is, oh gosh, how did you get yourself into that? That's a shame. Well, you probably shouldn't have even spoken to him. You shouldn't have even got into a situation where you're in a relationship. There is a time and a place, and that time is not in practice. That time is not when you are working with the children and the families. Judgment has to be removed. You have to speak to people as people. They are human. And it means that we are all going to be doing things that in our lives we might reflect on and think, oh, that was a bit silly. Or perhaps that was something we could have looked at differently. And we must share those experiences. We have to come from a place of honesty. So when any mothers or any fathers or any grandparents or any cousins, uncles, whatever, because I was working with the whole family, when they came to me, I too shared in them all of the traumas and dramas that I might have been through as well, because it's relatable content. I don't come in there as solely just a professional Liz. I'm coming there as my whole self. I talk about this all the time. When I had practitioners working, when I had parents, come in your whole self. If you want to come in at 7:30 in the morning and the music is on 100 decibels, do that. Do you understand? Like, drive to the nursery. That was often the case, because sometimes that's what parents needed, just to get out of the house and to the nursery.
Yeah, I hear that.
And it's about then accepting that that's what they need to do.
So where does things like therapy fit in this space?
Therapy can fit in by finding the right kind of therapy and finding the right kind of therapist. Of course, there is a time and a space. Talking therapy is very important, and that's what I spent a lot of time, I would say, doing in my role. Although I'm not a qualified therapist,
yes,
but the process of understanding that there's a need to have space where you can talk, that's really, really important. Therapy, of course, is very important, but only if the parent feels like they want to be in that space, because there's still a distrust between the type of therapists that are out there and available and cultural compatibility. You know, we have a lack of black and brown therapists specifically to work in these spaces with those parents and those families.
And I guess that's one of my worries when we're talking about practitioners, because a lot of the literature talks about reactive interventions, cultural competency, or people that's not competent in general to respond. And why I asked specifically about therapy is because everybody thinks, yeah, I'm a good listener, so therefore I'm probably the best person in that space to talk to. And I feel like, you know, speaking to, you know, trauma specialists, you know, they're very clear about, yes, we can be trauma-informed practitioners, but we have to adopt the skills, we have to learn the skills and develop the attributes. And just saying that I'm a good listener is not enough. And what I'm saying is that there may be a danger that we have the passion, we wear our hearts on our sleeve to want to support and change things, but actually we actually may be damaging. And I think that's one of my biggest fears, that I'm engaging with a young person. Yes, I'm compassionate, I'm congruent, it's person-centered in terms of the approach that we're engaging that person, but I'm not a trauma specialist. So how do we kind of support those parents that just want to get out of the house and get to the nursery, or a child that is witnessing so many things inside of their household? You know, what are the type of skills and what things do we need to be considering if we want to be practitioners that can aid those children or those parents?
You know, we talk a lot about CPD and interdisciplinary approaches and thinking about how we use the networks that we have and how we create the network. So going back to the example of me utilising you and knowing you were in my network, there was something that you were able to bring that I wasn't able to. And part of this work is about acknowledging where you cannot do everything.
100%.
Because if you start getting into a space of being everything to everybody, the impact of that is that you then are totally burnt out. And I also am guilty of this. And it was part of the decision really that led to me stepping away from the nursery in terms of being a nursery manager and working in a space where I was informing practitioners. And I think one of the things that we are not very good at when it's very person-centered is knowing when to step away and handing over the baton to somebody else who is a specialist in that area. But really testing for the competency of that person before you pass the baton. So before I brought you into the nursery, I knew everything I needed to know about you in terms of your ability to do the work that I wanted you to do. I didn't just bring you in, as I said, because you're Craig, so what? But you saw that really helped to bridge the gap in terms of trust between the families because they knew you. I invited you back for graduation all the time, so you would always come back for graduation and you would talk about the experiences you'd had with the children to their families. But also recognising I couldn't do that. I wouldn't have been able to do that because they're used to seeing Liz. Liz talks like this all the time. What does it feel like to hear somebody else speak about their children?
Yeah.
You know, so it's just about recognising the gap, knowing that you have to have a multidiscipline approach to child rearing, to early childhood, to your practice. One person cannot do all.
Yeah. And you know what? I must say, very often, I'm speechless. Put it that way. You've taught me some things today, but what you've also done is put a lot of things for me in perspective. You know, I'm still learning. I'm humble enough to say I don't know it all. And it's really kind of shifted my thinking, but also pushed me into a particular area of when I'm writing things and I'm trying to convey things, I guess, to the people we serve in our community, most definitely has been done so.
Thank you all the time.